Guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello. My name is Caitlin Elliott, and I post videos on true crime cases every single Tuesday and Friday. And for Black History Month, I've been trying to cover as many African American cases as I possibly can. So today, I'm going to be covering the case of Emmett Till. So if you do have any cases you would like me to cover between the days of February 1st through March 1st, please let me know. I'm trying to cover as many as I can, trying to get out as many as I possibly can. And so, let's begin. So, in my last video, I talked about Tupac Shakur, and today I'm going to be talking about the murder of Emmett Till. And have you all heard about this case? Because I remember learning about this case when I was actually in high school, I believe. We were talking about it in history class, and I was just stunned beyond belief that this had happened. And I don't even think I've ever seen anybody on YouTube actually cover the case of this poor boy. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. So Emmett Louis Till, he was born on July 25th of 1941 to parents Mamie Carthren and Louis Till. And he was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. And his father, Louis, was actually in the United States Army at this time. And both of his parents were actually relatively young when he was born. His mother was around 16 years old, and his father was around 18 years old. So in 1941, the United States ended up being involved in World War II after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and the Pearl Harbor Naval Base here in Hawaii. And Mamie and Louis, they ended up divorcing a year later in 1942 when Louis had actually cheated on Mamie. And Louis was actually said to be extremely abusive towards Mamie. And there was at one point where he got so mad at her that he choked her unconscious in a fit of rage. And when she had woken up, she had boiled a pot of hot water and she threw it at him. And when Louis was arrested, he was told that he needed to choose between going to jail for domestic violence or joining the United States Army, so he joined the Army. So, while being stationed in Italy, Louis was actually found guilty of sexually assaulting 2 white Italian women, which during that time, that's very frowned upon because blacks were not supposed to advance onto whites, and it was just a big no-no back then. And he was actually tried for this by the United States Army, and he was executed by hanging at the age of 23 on July 2nd of 1945, just a couple weeks before Emmett's fourth birthday. And he was actually executed by the United States Army themselves. So his mother, Mamie, was born in a small town in Mississippi called Webb. And around the time, the South was still being controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. And it made violence in the South towards blacks an extremely common occurrence because they allowed it. And it got so bad to the point that when Mamie was 2 years old, she and her family moved from Webb, Mississippi to Chicago, Illinois, so their family could be safe from harm. And during the 1950s, Mississippi was known as being one of the poorest states in the entire country. And the average income just for the whites alone was $690. $690. That's like a whole paycheck nowadays for some people. I worked fast food and my paychecks at some points were like $700 just for 2 weeks. So that's actually crazy. And in the year 1957, Emmett, he became very sick at the age of 6 years old with a viral disease called polio. And polio is an infectious disease caused by the virus called the polio virus. And the 2 major patterns of polio infections are minor illness that doesn't involve the central nervous system, and there's one that does involve the central nervous system. So when Emmett had actually recovered from this illness, which can cause permanent paralysis, he was left with a permanent stutter. So after divorce from Emmett's father, Mamie, she met a man named Pink Bradley, and they got married quite quickly. And however, their marriage only lasted for about a year. And both Mamie and Emmett, they moved together to Chicago's South Side, getting an apartment together. And at this time, Mamie began looking for work to help provide for her and Emmett. And she wanted to just work anywhere she could because at this point she was just desperate for money to take care of her and her family. So she ended up finding a job working as a civilian clerk for the United States Air Force. And while she was working this job, she would be away from home, and Emmett, he would do whatever it would take to take care of the house. So it was at this time that Mamie started saying that Emmett did not know his own limitations when it came to his anger. And it was just very apparent to her a couple years later. So Pink Bradley, even though he and Mamie were separated at the time, I'm not 100% sure if they were fully divorced or if they were just separated and getting the paperwork done on the divorce, but either way, they were not together. And he started just showing up at the home randomly, and he was just harassing Mamie. And he was saying just all sorts of belligerent things to her. And at this time, Emmett, he was 11 years old, and he felt like he really needed to defend his family. So at one point, Pink showed up to start harassing Mamie, and Emmett, he was just not having it. So he had a quick temper, and in a desperate attempt to protect his mother and protect his family, he pulled out a butcher knife and started threatening Pink with it, saying that he would kill him if he did not get out of the house. Honestly, I don't blame him. I probably would have done the same thing. So Emmett, like most boys his age, he was quite the prankster, and when people weren't expecting it, he would pull all sorts of elaborate pranks. And he would just try to do this to make his friends and family laugh. And there was at one point where he was going on a family trip, and he had, they were going on a long ride, so he started thinking of all these different types of pranks he wanted to do to his family while they were sleeping. So one of his friends, while they were sleeping, he pulled into one of his friend's bags and pulled out a pair of underwear and put it on his friend's head. And when the friend woke up, Emmett, he just started laughing and laughing at what he had done. And another thing about Emmett is that he loved being the center of attention. And he would just brag and tell all sorts of elaborate tales to try to have everybody look at him and get attention. So his mother, Mamie, she had an uncle named Mose, and he was very close to Emmett. And he would tell the boy tales about what life was like back in Mississippi when he was growing up. Because remember, I told you Mamie's family, they were from Mississippi and they had moved to Chicago. So whenever he was talking about the lifestyle in Mississippi Delta, he was also talking about the racism there. Because like I said, it was very racist in the South back then. So Emmett, he decided that after hearing these stories, he wanted to experience this for himself. So he tells his mother that he wants to travel to Mississippi, and his mother says yes and allows him to travel there with some relatives. But she warns Emmett straight away about how to correctly behave around the whites while living there. And that Mississippi was a different place than Chicago, because Chicago, even though it was the 50s, there was a little bit of racism, racial tension, but it was not as bad as it was down in the South that was controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. So Emmett told her that he had promised to be on his best behavior while visiting. So since the year of 1882, there had been 500 blacks lynched in just the state of Mississippi alone. 500 blacks between 1882 and the year of 1955 when this was taking place. That's insane. Now, when this occurred in 1955, lynchings were not as common as they were back in like the 1870s up until the 1930s. It was just constantly, but they still occurred. It was just very rare that they occurred. So in the South during the 1950s, segregation was a very important, I'm saying important with finger quotes because it was deemed important back then, but I think it's stupid to have segregation anyways. But it was a very important part of life. And in the South, it was very strongly opposed and prohibited to have any type of interracial relationships because they wanted to maintain the white supremacy rule. And that included even friendships between whites and blacks, which at this day and age, you would be like, excuse me, it was just insane. So even just the suggestion of a black male being with a white female was punishable by law. I'm not 100% sure if it was what it was like vice versa, if it was okay for a black female and a white man to be together because it's a white man. I have no idea. That's just what I was researching, and found that it was very frowned upon to be a black man and be with a white female. So, just a year prior, in the year of 1954, the court had ruled Brown versus the Board of Education, which meant that there needed to be integration in the school. Now, when this occurred, racial tension in the South just increased tenfold. Everyone was pissed off because they didn't want to have any type of integration. And they were white Southerners were worried that this integration in schools would lead to interracial relationships, which, like I said, was deeply frowned upon back in the South. So just 1 week before Emmett traveled to Mississippi, there was a black man. His name was Lamar Smith. And he was shot and killed. It wasn't stated specifically why he was shot and killed, but he was shot and killed. And this worried the family immensely. And because they didn't want to have anything happen to Emmett, and they were worried about his safety while being down in Mississippi. So after the murder of this poor black man, 3 white supremacists down in Mississippi were arrested and tried for the murder of this man, but they were all acquitted and released by the police with no charges against them, which is ridiculous in my opinion. So Emmett, he arrived in Money, Mississippi on August 21st of 1955, and he started getting settled in the state quite quickly. He started making a lot of friends, and he started hanging out a lot with his cousin named Curtis. So just a few days later, on August 24th of 1955, the two of them, they actually skipped church, which, if you're in the South, there's a lot of Southern Baptists, and Southern Baptists think very highly of the Lord and going to church. Like, it was like the number one rule down there was you always went to church on Sundays. So the fact that they had skipped church, this was a big no-no. So the two of them, they decided, now that they had skipped church, let's go to the local grocery store. And this local grocery store was called Bryant's Grocery Store. And they wanted to pick up some candy. So the store was actually owned by a white couple. It was 24-year-old Roy Bryant and his 21-year-old wife, Carolyn Bryant. And Carolyn, she was actually working the front of the store when the boys came in and wanted some gum. And her sister-in-law, which is Roy's sister, was in the back with all the children there because they had brought their Carolyn's nieces and nephews to the store. So what happened after the boys came into the store, it's still unclear of what truly occurred. And it's said by Carolyn at this time, back in the 50s, that Emmett had showed a picture to his friends of a picture of him at school. And it was a class picture, like one of those class pictures you take while you're like in elementary school. I'm talking about, that was a big thing back in like the 90s and the early 2000s. People still did that. And he showed them a picture of like the integrated class he was in. And now the other boys, they thought this was insane because, segregation was still an everyday occurrence here. Like, they thought about integration, like they couldn't fathom it occurring. They couldn't relate to it. So he even pointed out to this white girl in the photograph, and he said that this white girl was his girlfriend. And the boys then started telling Emmett, supposedly, to go up and talk to Carolyn Bryant, the wife of the owner of the store. So, however, it was said in later interviews by Emmett's cousin Simon that wasn't true, and he never had a photograph of him in an integrated classroom, and nobody dared him to go talk to Carolyn. So, according to several witnesses at the time, it's been stated that Emmett whistled at Carolyn, which I'm sure, like, as a woman myself, there's a lot of things, like, catcalling. Men, you would whistle, tell, like, just hoot and holler out the doors of cars, and that's what it was assumed that Emmett was doing. So Simon, he claimed that Emmett had done this to make them laugh. And they were all understandably shocked because, again, this is the 1950s. This is Mississippi, the South, segregation, and they were just appalled that he would whistle. So Simon, he told police that as soon as he had whistled, they got the hell out of there. Like, they got out of there as fast as they could because they didn't want anything to happen. So even though it said that Emmett whistled at the store, his family said that he actually his family had said, and like I said earlier, that he had a stutter from his incident with polio, and in order to help alleviate that stutter and to make it not as terrible as it would have been, because he struggled a lot with the letter B, and when you're trying to buy bubble gum, he wasn't going to go bubble gum. So he wanted to help him calm down so he could say it, very easy, like a lot easier instead of stuttering. So he would whistle to try to help with saying the letter B. So once the boys left, Carolyn was said to have quickly gone to her car and grabbed a handgun. And it is unclear if he had whistled because he was trying to get the bubble gum, or if he was whistling at her, or if he was whistling at this checkers game that was across the street. It's unclear as to why he had whistled. And after this had happened, the boys, they all left, they ran across the street, and they were looking for Curtis Jones, the uncle. And they explained to Curtis what had happened. And Curtis told them to quickly leave the area and to go back to the house, for which Emmett started complaining that he wished he never came and he just wanted to go home. And when I read that hurt my heart. I was like, oh, this poor guy. Just trying to go visit some family, and, he just got stuttered. He can't even speak properly, and, this happens. That's just terrible. This poor family. So Carolyn Bryant, she didn't want anybody to know what had happened at the time because she really didn't think it was all that important. She really didn't think anything about it, but as it turns out, her husband, Roy, I'm thinking he was like 22 or 23 at the time. He wasn't that much older than Carolyn. I think he was 24. And he gets told by somebody who was at the store and witnessed Emmett whistling and said that, he was whistling at her. So, whenever he saw Carolyn next, Roy went absolutely apeshit ballistic on Carolyn, begging to know why she never told him that this had happened. And she had said that she never told him about the encounter because she was worried that he would have done something to Emmett, and she was worried about Emmett's safety. And when Roy found out about this, he started questioning people right away, and he was going just all around town, looking for just started questioning all these several young men very aggressively, trying to demand answers and why anyone of that color would be talking to his wife and who was talking to his wife. Because at this time, it wasn't known to them that it was Emmett and his cousin. They didn't know. So he then forced this poor black guy named J.W. Washington to come with him to search for this boy who had whistled at his wife, Carolyn. And while driving around, they actually approached a young black teenager, and Roy ordered J.W. to stop the car. And he then had J.W. forcibly kidnap this poor boy, and they started to drive back to the store with this poor boy in the back seat of the car. And they pulled in and forcibly brought him into the store I think they said it was by his neck. They had him by the back of his neck, just bringing him into the store, just dragging him in. And several people said at the time, they were like, you've got the wrong boy. That's not him. That is not the boy that was in here whistling and whatever else he was doing. Because at this time, people were just spreading lies. And it was somehow said to Roy, I don't know who said this, but it was told to Roy that the boy that was whistling at Carolyn was the boy that was staying with Mose Wright, aka Emmett. And several people in the store actually overheard Roy saying that he and J.W. Milan, not to be confused with J.W. Washington, it's a different J.W. I guess that's a common nickname back then, J.W. And they were planning on kidnapping Emmett. So on August 28th of 1955, between the hours of 2 and 3:30 in the morning, I don't know why anybody was awake at this hour, Roy and J.W. Milan, they drove to Mose Wright's house, and they immediately start looking for Emmett. And they're armed with guns and a flashlight. So J.W. was physically armed with a gun and a flashlight. So he asked Mose Wright if he had 3 boys staying with him from Chicago, which he replied, yes, which honestly, if I had someone, waving a flashlight in my face with a gun, I would say yes too. You never know if they're going to shoot you. So J.W., he starts demanding to see, and quoted, "the Negro that did the talking." And I'm trying to simplify what he said because he actually used a racial derogatory term, and I will not use that word on my channel because that's a very disgusting word, and I despise that word and anyone who uses the hard R. So Emmett's great aunt actually offered the men money in order to leave Emmett alone, but they didn't want money. They refused to take it, so he starts rushing Emmett to put on all his clothes. And Mose tries to explain that Emmett was from up north and didn't know no better, as he said. So this infuriated J.W., and he asked Mose how old he was, and Mose said 64. Why? And J.W. had snapped at him, saying if he didn't... I don't even want to get into it real quick, but I'm just going to tell you right now, if anybody talked to me this way, or any of my family members that way, I don't care what color you are, you could be white, I could be black, and this could be in the 50s, if you're going to talk to me like that, or my family members like that, you better be backing those up with some fists, because I will be coming after you. I don't care how little I am, I would not stand for that shit. And so the men, they asked him his age, and he said 64, and he said, if you say anything, you tell anybody what's going on, you would not live to see 65. So the men, they drag Emmett out to the car, and they drove up to Mose Wright's house, and they asked somebody in the car, because they were going out of his house, going up to the car that was parked. Sorry, I didn't mean drive. Like they had driven up to his house to get the boy. They were walking out back to the car. There was someone else in the car, and they're asking this other person in the car if this was the boy who had whistled, and the person inside the car said yes. And it was said that this voice was a female, and this female has not been identified to this day as to who was in the car. But I'm sure we can all infer that the person inside the car was Carolyn Bryant. So Roy and J.W., they start saying that they're going to bring Emmett to the Bryant grocery store. And then they stated that this shouldn't be necessary because Emmett already admitted talking to Carolyn. He was like, yeah, it was me. And I can only imagine how terrified Emmett was, because I feel like if any of us were in his shoes or in his situation, we all would have been terrified out of our minds, no matter what color we were, no matter what was going on. I personally would have been terrified. Kidnapping is like one of my biggest fears. So the 2 men, they kidnapped him, obviously, and they hogtied him into the back of their truck. And they were not telling Emmett exactly where they were going or what was going on. And the 2 were actually taking Emmett back to Money, Mississippi, where they started pistol whipping him, which is basically when you beat the shit out of someone with a gun. And they beat this poor boy until he was actually unconscious. So there was actually a teenager at the time. His name was Willie Reed. And he is said to have been a witness to what had happened to Emmett. And so, in the year of 1955, Willie Reed, he was 18 years old at the time, and he said that he had witnessed a very suspicious-looking truck going down his way. So, as it passed him, he thought it was very bizarre, because he noticed that there was 2 white men in the front of the truck and 2 black men in the back of the truck. And one of the black males was actually a teenager. So Willie, he was walking home a little bit farther after the truck had passed him. He continues walking, and he starts to pass this barn. And while he's passing the barn, he pauses because he starts to hear something that alarms him. And what he's hearing is the sounds of someone being beat, and there's the sounds of someone crying. And he begins to walk a little farther up the road, and he notices that there's a water well there, and he gets approached by J.W. Malam. And J.W., being the shithead that he is, starts aggressively questioning Willie, like, asking him if you've heard anything. And he's like, did you hear anything? Did you fucking hear anything? Like, saying, like, some type of, like, he was just going off on this poor guy. And Willie, you know, he was very obviously scared because he had no idea what the hell was going on. So he starts shaking his head like, no, I didn't hear anything, even though he obviously did. So later, there was a local neighbor named Leroy Collins, and he was actually in the back of the barn. And he had been very concerned because he noticed that there was a lot of blood in a truck. And there was like so much blood in this truck that this neighbor actually became concerned that something was very wrong. And like, there was just a lot of, like, a pool of blood. The entire back end of the pickup truck was like filled with blood. Like, it was really bad. So he starts walking up to the area, especially, and then he notices Emmett Till's boot. And so he walks up to J.W. Malam and asks him about the boot. He's like, why is this boot just around here? It's covered in blood. Like, this is weird. What is this boot for? And so J.W. Malam starts snarling back at this neighbor that boot was his, and it was just bloody because he had just killed a deer and he should mind his own effing business. So I wonder if, like, anybody noticed that the boot was actually smaller than JW's feet, because it said that JW was a big guy and Emmett was like 5'4", 5'5", and I don't know what type of shoe size that Emmett had, but I'm gonna claim that it probably was a lot smaller, like maybe like a size 8 men's, and JW probably had bigger feet. So the fact that he was saying like this was his boot and wasn't matching his foot size, I wonder if anyone put 2 and 2 together, you know what I mean? So some actually started stating that Emmett was actually shot and was tossed over the Black Bayou Bridge in Glendora, Mississippi. But at this time, you know, it was still unclear of what would happen because there was no body, there was nothing to stimulate any type of a crime had happened, except other than the boy was kidnapped. And it was stated that the group had driven back to Roy Bryant's home and they started just burning Emmett's clothes. And I wonder if Carolyn actually noticed this and knew what was going on, or if, you know, she didn't, maybe she did notice it but was just too scared to say anything. So J.W. Malam actually stated they only wanted to scare Emmett Till. They just wanted to scare him. And he's saying something went horribly wrong. Okay. And the reason I'm saying okay is because, like, clearly it's something, they weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to do something more than just scare him. Ugh, people are just ridiculous. And they eventually had beaten Emmett. They shot him in the head, killing him, and then they tied his body to a fan. I'm thinking it's one of those, they didn't say what type of fan it was, but I'm thinking because it was Mississippi, they had the whole cotton thing in Mississippi, they might have tied him to a cotton gin fan, and they said that the fan was put into the Mississippi River to try to drag his body down to the bottom of the river so that no one would find it. So Mose Wright, poor Mose Wright, he is still sitting on the porch of his house waiting for Emmett to come back. and he just gets waiting and waiting and waiting, and after a while he just gets tired of waiting, and he and his wife, they actually left their home and they started driving around Money, Mississippi, looking for any signs of Emmett to see if they could find him anywhere. And a lot of people afterwards were asking Mose right away, they're like, why didn't you just go to the police right away? Why did you drive around and search for him? And Mose, he said that he couldn't go to the police right away because he had been threatened with his life by these men. And he didn't want anything to happen to him. So Curtis Jones, he was actually the one who ended up calling the LaFleur County Sheriff's Office that day. And he then, after calling the sheriff's office, he then called Emmett's mother over in Chicago and told her what was going on. So after Mose had called Emmett's mother, the couple, they drove to Sumner, Mississippi. This is not to be confused with Sumner, South Carolina, where the Civil War took place. No, this is a different place. So they wanted to go and contact the county sheriff. And so the police, they started looking very heavily into this case because it was involved, seemed like it was a lynching. It could have been a lynching. It could have been, they thought it was a kidnapping at this time. They started just wanting to figure out what had happened to this poor boy because he's a minor at this time. And they had the police sheriff himself. His name was George Smith, and he drove to the homes of both Roy Bryant and J.W. Milan, and he questioned them, do you know what happened to Emmett Till? And both of the men, they fully admitted to kidnapping Emmett. They're like, yeah, we took him, but we let him go. We released him. We don't know what happened to him after that. So at this time, they were arrested for kidnapping. So unfortunately, Emmett's still missing. No one has seen Emmett since he was taken. So, fast forward 3 more days after Emmett's abduction. Poor Emmett, his lifeless body and disfigured body was found in the Tallahatchie River. It's not said who had found him, but it was reported that his body was found. So Emmett's head was just extremely mutilated, and he had not only been shot just above his right ear, but he was shot above his right eye as well, and it was so bad that his right eye was actually dislodged from his head. And if that wasn't bad enough, if that wasn't gruesome enough, he had been beaten severely on his back, his hips, and his body had been weighed down in the water by a fan blade that had been tied around his neck, and it was tied with barbed wire. I have no idea where they got this barbed wire from, but they used it to tie the fan to his neck. And it was an incredibly just vicious and gruesome crime. And the police, they had called Mose Wright immediately after this body had been found to have him come and identify it to see if it is in fact Emmett Till's. And unfortunately, it was Emmett's body. So the lynchings were all, they occurred all throughout the South. Emmett's was actually extremely known because of the fact that it was said that he had talked to a white woman in the South, and that was very frowned upon back then, like I said. So his body, though extremely disfigured, it had been clothed in a tuxedo, a very nice tuxedo like you would wear to church or a special event, and his body was packed in lime to help keep the body preserved, and it was put into a pine wood coffin. And even though this was Mississippi and a large majority of the state was not only segregated but also run by the Ku Klux Klan, whites were just controlling the South, there was public outrage as to what had happened to this boy. Mississippians were pissed off that this had happened to this boy. And like I said, this was the 50s, so I was just mind blown that they were pissed off about it. I mean, thank God they were. But a lot of people didn't feel like blacks were as superior as whites, so I was just happy. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling at this point. I'm so sorry. So the governor at the time, his name was Hugh L. White. And he had stated they would try to pursue this death with a very vigorous prosecution. That is what he had said. So even though the Florida County Sheriff, the deputy at the time, his name was John Conthran, and he was livid. And he had stated back in 1955, the white people around here feel pretty mad about how that poor boy was treated, and they won't stand for this. And that is a direct quote from him. So the NAACP, they had a executive secretary at the time, and his name was Roy Wilkins. And that's not to be confused with Roy Bryant. I guess Roy was just a very popular name back then. So he was the first person to publicly actually announce that Emmett's death was considered a lynching. He even stated that he very strongly said that the state of Mississippi was trying to maintain white supremacy in the South through unlawful murder. And there was also a very outspoken African-American man, and his name was T.R.M. Howard. And he had told the media that he believed that he told the media what he felt and believed about this case. And now T.R.M., he was not only a black man, but he was one of the richest blacks in the state, which is saying something because Mississippi was not that rich. And he warns that if this is okay, and if this keeps happening, there is going to be a second civil war if the, quoted, slaughtering of Negroes, unquoted, was allowed. And I don't blame him one bit for thinking that way. I would have been all over that too. So the Tallahatchie County Police, they were putting every ounce of effort that they could into this case. And they wanted to find those responsible and put them behind bars as soon as they could, because they didn't want these people out and about. So nobody really wanted the reputation of being known as a state or a county or a city where a bunch of white men killed a 14-year-old black boy. They didn't want to be known to have a terrible reputation like that. So, especially if nothing was done about it. So the police, they began looking into both J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant. And they were trying to find any type of evidence that they could to arrest them. But on September 3rd, the main guy that was involved, the big police chief, he publicly announced on September 3rd that he wasn't even 100% sure if this was even the body of Emmett Till, after he straight up said it was the body of Emmett Till. And when I read that, I thought to myself, I was like, maybe he got paid off by Roy Bryant's family, because remember, they owned a grocery store. They were probably like rolling in dough. So he was probably paid off to say something. At least that's just my theory. That's just my opinion. I'd like to know what you guys think down below if you agree with me. But I'm going to continue moving on with the case. So they were then, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, they were then indicted for murder. And because there were two white men being accused of murdering a black boy in 1955 Mississippi, the state prosecutor, Hamilton Caldwell at the time, he stated that he wasn't even sure if this was going to go anywhere, or if the courts were even going to sympathize with this, because of it being the 1950s and Mississippi. So especially because they had said that this little black boy had harassed a white woman. So they were just worried that this was not going to go anywhere. So the trial for Emmett's case, it actually took place in Sumner, Mississippi, where hundreds of people had actually gathered outside of the courthouse to hear what would be going on. So the reason why this had taken place in Sumner, Mississippi was because this was where Emmett's body had been found. It had been found in Sumner, so they wanted to keep it local. And the trial was absolutely incredible. And it said that a man named David Halberstam, I hope I'm saying that right, Halberstam, he was quoted by the media saying that the trial was the first major media event of the civil rights movement. And the day before the trial, a man named Frank Young, he told T.R.M. Howard, the rich guy, that there were, in fact, 2 witnesses to the crime. So, the witnesses' names were Levi Too Tight Collins. I don't know why his nickname is Too Tight, but that's his nickname, Too Tight. And the other witness was Henry Lee Loggins. Now, these men were actually 2 black employees of a man named Leslie Malam. Leslie Malam, and he was the brother of J.W. Malam. And Leslie stated that it was his shed and his property that Emmett was actually brought to. And both Levi and Henry were spotted by other people with J.W. Malam, Roy Bryant, and Emmett Till. So they wanted to tell their side of the story. But however, the 2 employees were arrested for helping out, and they were unable to testify in court, which makes me think that maybe they were arrested to prevent them testifying in court. I don't know, it's just my theory. So in November of 1955, the grand jury, they refused to say that Roy Bryant and J.W. Malam were guilty of murdering Emmett, even though they admitted to kidnapping him. So as one can understand, the people were just absolutely appalled and just pissed off about this trial. They were furious. They were like, are you shitting me? They literally kidnapped him, and then the boy was found dead. They had to have murdered him. Who else could it have been? So they were just posting this all over Mississippi through the newspapers. And newspaper outlets were actually being interviewed at the time, but they said that, the newspaper outlets they were saying that the courts had done their job and there was nothing wrong. Like, are you freaking kidding me? There wasn't nothing wrong? These guys, literally kidnapped this kid and he was found dead. What do you mean there's nothing wrong? It's had me, I was so mad when I was researching this case. I was up pacing at 2 o'clock in the morning because I was so mad. And then in October of 1955, as if this poor family hadn't suffered enough already with Emmett being killed, the newspaper called the Jackson Daily News. Sorry, I could getting all tongue-tied over here. They wrote an article about Emmett Till's birth father, and they went into great detail about how he raped 2 white women and killed a third, ended up being publicly hanged. Remember, we talked about this earlier. And of course, Mamie Till, not Amy, Mamie Till, she had no idea that her husband had done all of this. So as they published this in the newspaper, this was her way of finding out. So she's obviously ticked off and upset. I'm upset when I found out about it, that she had found out through the newspaper that her husband had done that. Talk about respecting someone's privacy. I can only imagine how terrible that must have been for their family. So once this article came out, people actually started questioning Carolyn's integrity to the story and thinking that she made up a lot of shit because she probably knew about what Emmett's father had done and was just trying to, rile up some shit. So, of course, this was all just speculations and rumors. There is not any type of physical evidence or any type of listed evidence that people actually assumed that this is what she felt and what she knew. So, in the year of 2016, this was just 6 years ago. Forgot what year it was for a minute. There was a man named John Edgar Wideman, and he stated because of the article about what happened with Emmett's father, nobody wanted Roy and JW to be found guilty because they thought that, they assumed that Emmett's father was a rapist, so that could mean that Emmett could have been a rapist, father like son. That's what people were assuming. They just wanted them to be found not guilty because they were just trying to protect the state of Mississippi from a possible rapist at the time. Again, I'm not saying I believe any of these things. This is literally what was stated in documentaries that I watched and lots of newspaper articles that I read. So, John, he really started believing that what had happened to Lewis Till, aka Emmett's father, was racially motivated because he was black. So back in the year of 1956, this was a year after what had happened to Emmett, J.W. Milam, he admitted to straight up shooting and murdering Emmett, along with Roy Bryant as his accomplice. Is that the accomplice? There we go, accomplice. And this just shocked everybody because they all assumed that they were not guilty. And this really upset people is whenever, after they said that they killed this boy, both he and Roy Bryant said they felt like they did nothing wrong and they were protecting their white nationality from polluted blacks. So they even went so far as to even justify why they did what they did, why they felt that way. And they were just doing that so people could be sympathetic towards them and see their side of the story. Well, as you can imagine, this was a year later after they had already been acquitted and told, like they were not guilty. People were furious. They could not believe that these guys could have done something like that. And all the support that they had to back up their innocence just diminished like a flame from a candle, gone. And people were just absolutely disgusted by their crime, the fact that they had actually done something like this. And they were even more disgusted by their lack of remorse for doing the crime. Because like I said, they felt like they did nothing wrong. And as you can imagine, nobody wanted them working for them. So the grocery store ended up going out of business because no one wanted to shop there. Because why would you want to shop at a place where people openly admitted to killing a black kid? And nobody wanted to be their friends anymore, which why would you want to be their friends in the first place? I don't know. And they lost a hell of a lot of money, especially when people wouldn't shop at the grocery store. So eventually things got so bad for Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam that they both packed up their belongings and quickly relocated to the state of Texas, which is probably maybe like a 9-hour drive from Mississippi. I didn't look into that. I'm so sorry, guys. So, in the year of 1961, this was 6 years after Emmett Till's death, Roy was actually driving around Texas. He was traveling somewhere. Wasn't sure where it was that he was traveling to, but it was said that he was traveling around Texas. And he had spotted a license plate there from Tallahatchie County, which is where he was from in Mississippi. So this delighted Roy. He was just thrilled. He was like, oh my gosh, he couldn't wait to see who this person was and see if they were from his part of town or whether or not he knew them. So he pulls up next to them and he very happily introduces himself. Hi, I'm Roy Bryant. And he wanted to make some small talk about growing up in Tallahatchie County. And this person, they stopped and they wanted to talk to him. But once they found out his name was Roy Bryant, the guy, he took off out of there like a bat out of hell. He did not want to be around and stick around and talk to him. So JW, on the other hand, he was said to end up having a very long and extensive criminal history after the year of 1955. And he ended up dying from spinal cancer at the age of 61. Now, as for Roy, it's said that he and Carolyn divorced. And I wasn't sure what year they divorced, but they did end up divorcing. And he ended up remarrying in the year of 1980. Though why anyone would marry him after what he just did just blows my mind. Maybe they didn't look into him or anything, like do a background check to see who this guy was. They just wanted to marry him. I have no idea. But he ended up remarrying. And he was convicted in both the year of 1984 and 1988 on a food stamp fraud, which if you don't know what food stamps are, it's to help people who are of lower income be able to provide food for their families. So he had faked these food stamps to get food. Yeah. And I find it kind of ironic because he owned a grocery store at one point, and he's over here struggling for food. That's not me going after anybody who uses food stamps. That's me laughing at him because he lost what he had for being a piece of shit. So, he ended up being interviewed in the year of 1985, which was 30 years after Emmett Till's death. And even after 30 years, he was still a hateful old bag. And he kept saying that he had nothing to do with Emmett Till's death, but, and this was quoted from him, if Emmett Till hadn't stepped out of line, that wouldn't have happened to him. But he was innocent. And what I'm saying is, like, if someone is saying that they were innocent of a crime, yet they had that hateful shit to say, you know, it just, if you're innocent, why would you say that then? Just say you're innocent and go on with your day, which of course we know that he wasn't innocent, but still. He was then interviewed for a second time in the year of 1994 about his involvement in Emmett Till's death. And Emmett's mother was actually listening to the interview at this time. And he was quoted saying that he had no remorse for what happened to Emmett, and that Emmett deserved everything that had happened to him. So Roy Bryant, he ended up passing away in the year of 1994 at the age of 63. And can you guess what he died from? Cancer. So in 2017, there was an interview that had taken place in 2008. And in 2017, this interview was leaked. And it was a 2008 interview with Carolyn Bryant herself. And this was officially released to the public. And she had stated that in her 1955 testimony, she had fabricated, or lied, basically, about what had really happened. And at the trial, Carolyn, she had stated that Emmett had grabbed her around the waist and said some pretty provocative things, like, how about a date, baby? Or just, like, saying stuff about, like, sexiness and stuff. I'm not going to get too into detail about it because it was just, it's a lie, it's irrelevant. And, I mean, it's not irrelevant though, but it was a lie. And I don't want to bring that type of shit in here. So, she was furious that they brought that up in the interview. And she was like, no, that never happened. And that she would never ever say such a thing. And Carolyn at the time could also, she couldn't remember exactly what had happened at the grocery store back in the year of 1955, but she is quoted saying, no matter what had happened, nothing that poor boy could have done could ever justify what happened to him. And that's the end of the quote. So the man who had interviewed her in 2008 stated that Carolyn had told him secretly, and this is the first time of her ever coming out and saying this, but that Roy apparently was just extremely abusive to Carolyn, and that he was quoted, the reporter was quoted saying that it was clear that she was frightened of her husband. And after all these interviews were released in December of 2021, so this was only 2 months ago, almost 3 months ago, the U.S. Department of Justice officially closed the case, and the Till family finally had some peace as to what had happened to Emmett. So as always, at the end of my videos, I like to talk about my personal thoughts and opinions, and my voice is going away. It's getting shot from talking for almost an hour. So I wanted to just start off and saying how happy I was about how I covered this case, because I was like, no one has covered this case. This case is just crazy. It's just, you know, like, he got killed basically over a lie that someone had said. You know, I was just like, it blew my mind. And I've only ever seen this case covered one other time by one other YouTuber on this YouTube, and her name was Georgia Marie. And I actually subscribe to her and I watch her videos sometimes. And unfortunately, because it was just her that I saw that covered this case, it still needs to get talked about more. His voice needs to be heard. His story needs to be told. And as always, my thoughts and prayers are with the family of Emmett Till at this time. And I hope that now that the woman Carolyn Bryant came out with the truth, it will ease the pain of what had happened to Emmett to this family. And as always, please like and subscribe to my channel. Please comment down below your thoughts and opinions about what you think happened to Emmett, whether or not this was, justice was served. And I just want to know your guys' opinions about what had happened to him. And please also comment down below what you guys want me to cover next time in other videos. And I always post on Tuesdays and Fridays, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. And thank you guys so much for listening to my almost hour-long video about what happened to this poor boy. And I will talk to you guys all in my next video. Bye, guys.